The night I finally opened the dam, the air smelled like wet iron and pine sap, and the creek below my porch sounded different than it ever had before. Lower, tense, like it was holding its breath. I stood there with my hand on cold steel, listening to water press and argue against concrete that had been poured before my grandfather was born. Somewhere down the valley, glass walls reflected moonlight from mansions that weren't supposed to exist, built by people who thought water was something you ordered, not something you respected. I remember thinking very calmly that by morning nothing would ever be the same again. But none of that made sense back then. Back then, the creek was just part of my life, like my own pulse. I grew up with it talking me to sleep through open windows, slipping over stones, swelling in spring, shrinking to a whisper in August. My family called it Alder Run, though it never showed up with a name on modern maps. My great-grandfather settled this land with a mule, a saw, and a paper deed written in looping ink that smelled faintly of mildew and thyme. The creek was the reason he chose this place. It fed the soil, cooled the summers, turned a simple farm into something that could survive droughts and bad years. When I was a kid, my father used to stand with his boots in the water every morning, coffee steaming in his hand, just listening. He said you could tell how the day would go by the sound. Fast water meant trouble. Slow water meant patience. He died before he could explain what that really meant, and by the time the trouble came, I understood it better than I wanted to. I stayed when everyone else left. That's how it usually goes. The town hollowed out, jobs dried up, kids moved to cities with names that sounded expensive. I worked construction, then maintenance, then whatever kept the lights on. I fixed my own roof. I patched my own fence. I paid my taxes on time and didn't ask for much. The creek kept running and I kept listening. Then one morning I woke up to silence. It wasn't total silence. Birds still moved, wind still slid through the trees, but the creek was wrong. I stepped outside with my coffee and felt it before I saw it. The sound was thinner, like a bad recording turned down too low. When I walked down to the bank, my boots sank into exposed mud that should have been underwater. Stones I'd never seen before stared back at me, dry and pale. Upstream, the water bent away from its old path, diverted into something straight and unnatural. I knew there were trucks. They came in a line, white and clean, with logos that meant nothing to me at first. Men in vests walked my fence line without asking. One of them smiled like we were already friends and told me I should be excited. Something big was happening, something that would raise values and bring life back to the valley. That was the first time I heard the name of the Homeowners Association, Ridgecrest Heights. It sounded like something you put on a brochure with drone footage and soft music. They were building luxury homes along the ridge, he said, smart homes, stone facades, infinity pools that looked down into the valley like gods leaning over a railing. I asked him why my creek was disappearing. He blinked like he hadn't expected the question. Then he told me it was all permitted, temporary construction impact, nothing to worry about. Water management improvements, actually, better for everyone. Here's something most people don't know. When someone says water management, what they usually mean is control. And control always has a direction. Within a week, the creek was half its old self. The frogs vanished. The air felt warmer, dust clung to my boots. I drove to the county office with my deed in a manila folder that had been folded and refolded so many times it felt soft as cloth. I waited under fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects. When my number was called, the clerk barely looked up. She told me everything checked out on their end, permits, environmental assessments. A variance approved quietly 6 months earlier. Ridgecrest Heights had rights to temporary diversion for construction purposes. When I said the word temporary like a question, she shrugged. Construction timelines vary. I went home with a headache and a knot in my chest that wouldn't loosen. The letters started arriving soon after. Official-looking envelopes with language designed to sound polite while telling you to sit down and stay quiet. Notices about access easements. Warnings not to interfere with infrastructure. One letter suggested I consider selling. Another hinted that my non-cooperation could complicate things. I didn't interfere, not at first. I watched. From my porch, I could see the ridge changing shape. Trees came down. Concrete went up. Sound of machinery echoed through the valley, grinding and beeping and shouting over itself. At night, lights burned where there had once been stars. And every day, the creek shrank a little more. When I finally confronted them again, it wasn't in an office. It was on my own land. A black SUV pulled up one afternoon, tires crunching on gravel. A woman stepped out wearing sunglasses too big for her face and shoes that didn't belong in dirt. She introduced herself as the HOA's legal liaison. She said my name like she'd practiced it. She told me I was being emotional. She told me change was hard. She told me water was a shared resource and that progress required sacrifice. I told her my family had been here 100 years before her HOA existed on paper. She smiled, thin and patient. She said history was interesting, but the future was binding. That was when the harassment started. Surveyors showed up unannounced, planting flags inches from my garden. Trucks blocked my driveway by mistake. Anonymous complaints about my property found their way to the county: junk, unsafe structures, unpermitted repairs. I'd lived here my whole life without an issue, and suddenly inspectors wanted to look under every board and beam. I lay awake at night listening to the creek cough its way through darkness, wondering if I was being stubborn for no reason. There was a moment, just one, when I thought about selling. Taking whatever money they offered and leaving before the place dried up completely. That doubt sat heavy in my chest, like a stone I couldn't swallow or spit out. But then I found my father's notebook. It was in a box I hadn't opened since the funeral, tucked behind old tools and receipts. The cover smelled like oil and smoke. Inside were sketches, measurements, notes written in a careful hand, drawings of the creek, of stonework, of something I'd always taken for granted: the dam. Most people thought it was just an old agricultural relic, a low concrete wall hidden by moss and trees upstream. It predated zoning laws, HOAs, even the county as it existed now. My great-grandfather built it to regulate spring floods and summer droughts, using stone and poured concrete reinforced with scrap iron. It wasn't on modern maps because no one had bothered to look. In the notebook, my father had written about water rights, about how back then land and water were bound together in ways people had forgotten. He'd copied sections of law by hand, underlining phrases, adding question marks in the margins. He'd known this day would come even if he hadn't lived to see it. I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun went down, papers spread around me, listening to the creek outside. It sounded tired, but underneath that I could hear pressure, stored potential, waiting. Outside on the ridge, Ridgecrest Heights kept building, confident and loud and blind to the ground beneath them. And that was when I realized they hadn't taken my creek. They'd only borrowed it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my father's notebook open, the pages curled at the corners, listening to the house settle and the creek struggle outside. Every few minutes, a truck growled past on the ridge road, carrying stone and steel toward houses that were already being advertised as waterfront views. That word stuck in my head, waterfront, like a lie told so often it started to believe itself. By morning, I had a plan, but it wasn't the kind you rush into. It was the kind that asks you to slow down so much it almost feels like surrender. Here, as something most people don't know, water law isn't about water, it's about paper. Deeds, dates, usage histories, structures built before certain laws existed. If you can prove continuous control and beneficial use that predates modern regulation, you don't just have an opinion, you have leverage. And leverage doesn't shout, it waits. I started quietly. I took a week off work and drove to archives most people don't even realize exist. County basements that smell like dust and old glue. Libraries with microfilm machines that hum and flicker like they're alive. I learned how to scroll through decades of handwritten minutes and plats, squinting at ink that faded before my parents were born. Every document felt like a small excavation, brushing dirt off something solid underneath. What I found made my hands shake. The dam wasn't just old. It was registered, not with the modern county, but with a territorial authority that existed before statehood. The filing included language I'd never seen in contemporary documents, phrases about perpetual control for flood mitigation and agricultural stability. There were addendums signed during a drought year, reaffirming rights in exchange for downstream protection. My great-grandfather hadn't just built a wall, he'd negotiated a responsibility, and that responsibility came with authority. I made copies, lots of them. I scanned everything twice. I kept notes about where each document came from, who certified it, which ledger it lived in. Receipts, as my father would have called them. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not neighbors, not the county, definitely not Ridgecrest Heights. Meanwhile, the pressure ramped up. One afternoon, I came home to find a notice taped to my door. Notice of violation, alleged encroachment. It claimed part of my fence interfered with a temporary access route for construction vehicles. The route wasn't marked on any map I'd ever seen. It cut straight through my lower pasture, right where the soil stayed damp from the creek. I called the number listed. A man answered who spoke fast and sighed a lot. He told me I had 48 hours to comply or face escalating fines. When I asked for documentation, he told me it had already been sent. When I said I hadn't received it, he told me to check my email. The email arrived an hour later, full of legal language designed to overwhelm. Attachments stacked on attachments. I printed it all and spread it across the table like a bad hand of cards. Then I compared it to my father's notes. They didn't match. That night, someone drove slowly past my house with their headlights off. I heard tires on gravel, the engine idling too long at the bend in the road. I didn't go outside. I didn't turn on lights. I let the house stay dark and quiet like it was listening too. The next week, the HOA liaison came back, this time with a man in a suit who didn't introduce himself. He stood a little too close, smiling without warmth. They talked about amicable resolution and mutual benefit. They slid a number across the table that made my throat tighten. More money than I'd ever had in my life, offered like a favor. All I had to do was sign. I looked at the paper. Then I looked out the window at the creek bed exposed and cracked at the dust rising from the ridge. I thought about my father standing barefoot in cold water, coffee steaming, listening. I told them no. The man in the suit stopped smiling. Things escalated after that, fast. A rumor spread that I was difficult, anti-development, that I was trying to extort the HOA. Someone filed a complaint claiming I'd threatened workers. Another claimed environmental violations on my property, illegal dumping, erosion hazards. Inspectors returned, this time with clipboards and cameras measuring, photographing, murmuring to each other. Through it all, I stayed calm. I answered questions. I provided documents when asked. I never raised my voice. Inside, though, something hardened. Not anger exactly. Resolve. The kind that feels like setting your feet into wet concrete and letting it cure. I drove up to the dam one evening as the sun dropped low, painting everything gold and red. The structure sat quiet and patient, water pooled behind it, pressing gently. I ran my hand along the rough surface, feeling the old iron beneath the stone. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't destruction. It was stewardship. Ridgecrest Heights had installed their own diversion upstream, pipes and channels designed to siphon flow toward their development. They'd done it under the assumption that nothing else controlled the system. They were wrong. I didn't open anything, not yet. Instead, I filed a request. Most people don't know you can do that. Request a historical verification. It's buried in statutes no one reads unless they have to. It triggers a review process that moves at the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say, slowly. But once it starts, it can't be ignored. The county acknowledged receipt. They assigned a case number. Ridgecrest Heights was notified automatically. The next call I got was not polite. They accused me of stalling, of abusing the system, of jeopardizing investments. I listened without interrupting, then calmly told them I was exercising my rights. There was a pause on the line, thick with disbelief. Construction slowed. Not because of me officially, but because uncertainty scares money. Contractors don't like questions without answers. Neither do banks. I could feel the tension shifting, subtle but real. One morning I woke to the sound of rain, not the gentle kind, heavy drops drumming on the roof, soaking the ground. I went outside and smelled earth opening up, releasing that deep, clean scent. The creek swelled, pushing against its narrowed channel, testing boundaries. Up on the ridge, runoff poured off raw slopes and unfinished driveways, racing downhill faster than anyone had planned for. I checked the weather reports. More rain coming. Days of it. The county scheduled a site visit. They brought engineers, historians, environmental officers. They walked my land, took measurements, compared notes. I showed them the dam, the old filings, my father's notebook. Some nodded, some frowned. One older man ran his hand along the stone and smiled just slightly. "This is solid," he said. "They don't build like this anymore." Ridgecrest Heights representatives hovered nearby, tight-lipped, making calls. That evening, a cease and desist letter appeared in my mailbox, delivered by courier. It claimed I had no authority to manipulate water flow. It threatened immediate legal action if I interfered with critical infrastructure. I laughed then, a short, surprised sound that startled me as much as it would have startled anyone else. Critical infrastructure. On land my family had protected for a century. I didn't respond. Instead, I went back to the dam as the rain intensified. Water rose behind it, dark and powerful, pressing with more insistence now. The sound changed, deeper, more urgent. Downstream, the creek roared back to life where it could, but it was constrained, forced through paths never meant to hold this much. I stood there in my raincoat, soaked through, heart steady. I wasn't going to open it yet. Timing mattered. Everything mattered. In the distance, I could see lights flicker at the construction site. Pumps whined. Alarms beeped. Workers scrambled under floodlights trying to keep water where they thought it belonged. They were fighting gravity. History. Paper they hadn't read. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from the county. Emergency meeting scheduled. Immediate attendance requested. I looked at the dam one more time, at the water waiting behind it, patient and relentless. Tomorrow, I realized the decision wouldn't be mine alone anymore. The emergency meeting was held in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, the kind of place where decisions get made without anyone remembering who made them. Rain hammered the windows so hard it felt like the building itself was being tested. I sat at the long table with my folder closed in front of me, hands folded, listening to voices rise and overlap. Ridgecrest Heights arrived with an entourage, lawyers in dark suits, consultants with tablets glowing blue, an engineer who kept glancing at his phone like it was a lifeline. They spoke first, of course. They always do. They talked about safety, about infrastructure risk, about my unauthorized structure posing a threat during extreme weather events. They said words like liability and downstream impact and urgent mitigation. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I slid copies across the table instead. Deeds, registrations, survey overlays, old filings stamped and signed by authorities whose names no longer existed but whose authority still did. Here is something most people don't know. When two sets of rights collide, the older one doesn't yield just because it's inconvenient. It yields only if it's wrong. And mine was. The room went quiet in that way that tells you someone has realized they're standing on thin ice. The county historian cleared his throat. The environmental officer leaned forward. The engineer stopped checking his phone. Ridgecrest's lead attorney tried to regain control, questioning authenticity, relevance, applicability. He spoke faster now. His words stacked up like sandbags, but the water was already finding gaps. Outside, the rain intensified. By the time the meeting adjourned, nothing had been resolved officially, which in practice meant everything had changed. The county issued a temporary hold on further diversions pending review. Ridgecrest Heights was instructed to monitor conditions closely and ensure no adverse impacts. They looked at me like I'd pulled a trick, like I'd cheated. But all I'd done was show up with history and patience. That night I drove back up to the dam under a sky that seemed determined to empty itself all at once. Wind bent the trees, leaves tearing loose and slapping wetly against the ground. The creek below roared now, angry and alive, straining against channels never meant to hold it. The water behind the dam was higher than I'd ever seen it. It pressed and swirled, carrying branches, foam, the smell of soil ripped free. I checked the spillway, cleared debris the way my father taught me, methodical and calm. The structure held just as it always had. Down the valley, sirens wailed. I didn't open anything, not yet. The law was catching up, slow and heavy, but it was moving. And I knew something else Ridgecrest Heights hadn't accounted for: their own design. They debuilt their stormwater system to handle averages, not extremes. Smooth channels, decorative retention ponds, buried pipes sized for predictable flows. They'd shaved margins to save money, trusting permits more than physics. The diverted creek fed into their system now, artificially concentrated, channeled straight through the heart of the development. Nature doesn't care about marketing brochures. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a man shouted over noise and rain. He introduced himself as a site supervisor. He said they were experiencing unexpected conditions. He demanded that I release water upstream to relieve pressure. I told him I wasn't authorized to make unilateral changes during an active review. He swore. He called me selfish. He said people's homes were at risk. I hung up. That was the hardest moment. The doubt crept back in, sharp and insistent. I pictured families who'd bought into those houses believing the promises. I pictured water where it shouldn't be. For a long minute, I stood in the rain, staring at the dam, heart pounding, wondering if holding steady was the same as causing harm. Then I remembered something my father wrote in the margin of his notebook, next to a sketch of the spillway. Controlled release prevents catastrophe. Panic creates it. I waited. At dawn, the rain finally eased. The sky lightened to a dull gray, and the valley steamed like it was exhaling. I drove down toward the ridge road, tires splashing through puddles, and that's when I saw it. Water where lawns had been, retention ponds overflowing their decorative stones. Mud streaked across driveways. A section of newly laid road slumped, one edge collapsing into a soaked trench. Workers stood around in rain gear, shoulders sagging, staring at the mess like it had betrayed them personally. No houses had been swept away. No one was hurt, but the damage was undeniable, and it was public. By noon, news trucks arrived. Cameras panned across soggy manicured grass and half-finished walls. Reporters talked about stormwater failures and questions about permitting. Ridgecrest Heights released a statement blaming historic rainfall. They didn't mention the creek. The county called me in again, this time not as a problem, but as a resource. We walked the land together, boots sinking into mud, measuring flows, tracing paths. I explained how the dam moderated surges, how the old system dispersed energy instead of concentrating it. I showed them where the creek wanted to go, where it always had. The engineers listened now. They asked questions. They took notes. Ridgecrest's representatives stayed back, whispering, making calls. A week later, the formal findings came out. The dam was recognized as a lawful historic control structure. My water rights were affirmed. The HOA's diversion was deemed non-compliant with existing upstream controls and ordered dismantled pending redesign. Fines were assessed for unauthorized alterations. Permits were suspended until corrective measures were approved. The tone shifted overnight. Calls from Ridgecrest Heights stopped being aggressive and started being careful. They asked for meetings. They suggested collaboration. They hinted at compensation again, this time framed as partnership. I declined. Instead, I proposed something else: restoration. We worked with the county and environmental groups to reestablish the creek's natural course through the valley. To reinforce banks, replant native species, remove the HOA's artificial channels. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't fast, but it was right. Ridgecrest Heights fought it, of course. Appeals, delays, quiet attempts to negotiate exceptions. Each one failed. Paper doesn't bend just because someone leans on it. As the months passed, the development stalled. Investors pulled out. Homes sat empty, water stains creeping up unfinished walls. The HOA board fractured, members blaming each other. Lawsuits flew in every direction, a storm of their own making. One evening, long after the rain had stopped and the creek had settled back into its old song, I stood by the dam again. I opened the gate just enough to release a measured flow, letting water move the way it was meant to, steady and controlled. The sound changed instantly, from pressure to promise. Downstream, the creek filled its banks without spilling over. Soil drank deep. Frogs returned. The valley breathed. I thought it was over then. I really did. But justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive all at once. Sometimes it waits for one more reveal. The reveal came quietly, the way the most devastating truths usually do, tucked into an envelope that didn't look important enough to change anyone's life. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped into my mailbox between a seed catalog and a power bill. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a single letter and a stack of photocopies held together with a paperclip already bent from use. The paper smelled faintly of toner and dust. The letter was brief. It said the firm represented a former contractor for Ridgecrest Heights. It said there were documents I might find relevant. It said the sender had seen my name in the county findings and believed the truth should be complete. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where my father's notebook had first cracked everything open, and I began to read. Here, as something most people don't know, large developments rarely break the law in obvious ways. They bend it instead. They shave corners, mislabel line items, reroute responsibility through shell companies until no single hand looks guilty. But paper always remembers what people try to forget. The contractor had been hired to install the diversion system. Pipes, channels, culverts. He'd raised concerns early about capacity, about soil stability, about the existence of upstream controls he discovered during initial surveys. He'd been told not to worry about it. Then he'd been told to stop asking questions. Finally, he'd been terminated for cause. Unpaid invoices swept under the rug. Included in the copies were emails, internal emails, messages between Ridgecrest Heights board members, developers, and consultants. Casual, confident language. Jokes about the old farmer downstream. Assurances that even if there was an issue, he won't have the resources to fight. One message chilled me more than the rest. It acknowledged the dam, acknowledged its legality, and then dismissed it as a manageable obstacle. They'd known. My hands trembled as I turned pages. There were budget sheets showing cost savings achieved by downsizing stormwater systems. There were notes about fast tracking permits before public comment periods closed. There was even a draft press strategy for reframing any future flooding as an act of God. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the creek murmuring outside like it was waiting to hear what I'd decide. This wasn't just about water anymore. I called the law firm. The attorney who answered sounded tired but relieved, like someone who'd been holding their breath too long. He told me his client didn't want money. He wanted the record set straight. He wanted protection from retaliation. He wanted the truth out. I told him I understood. The next steps required patience again, always patience. We looped in the county, then the state, environmental oversight bodies that moved slow but carried weight once they did. Whistleblower protections were filed, affidavits sworn, documents authenticated. Ridgecrest Heights sensed something before they knew what it was. Their calls turned frantic. They accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign. They threatened defamation suits. One board member showed up at my gate unannounced, red-faced, shouting that I was ruining lives. I didn't engage. I documented everything. When the story broke, it didn't explode. It spread. An investigative reporter picked it up first, the kind who reads footnotes and follows money. The article laid it out cleanly. Knowingly ignored upstream water rights, deliberately underbuilt stormwater systems, concealed risk assessments from buyers and regulators. It quoted emails. It named names, then others followed. Suddenly, Ridgecrest Heights wasn't a symbol of progress. It was a case study in arrogance. Buyers demanded refunds. Banks froze financing. Insurance providers reevaluated coverage. The phrase known flood risk began appearing in headlines, and that phrase is poison in real estate. The HOA board imploded in public meetings that felt more like trials. Neighbors who'd once defended the development now shouted about betrayal. People cried, people pointed fingers. The woman with the sunglasses stopped attending altogether. Legal consequences followed, slow but inexorable. Civil suits, regulatory penalties, criminal investigations into permit fraud and misrepresentation. The man in the suit who'd once smiled at my kitchen table testified under oath, his words careful and hollow. Through it all, I stayed mostly off camera. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. I just wanted the valley back. Work on the creek restoration accelerated, funded now not just by county grants but by court-ordered remediation funds. Heavy machinery returned, but this time it moved with respect. Channels were widened, curves restored. Native willows went into the ground, their roots destined to knit soil together over time. Children from local schools came out on field trips, boots too big, hands muddy, planting grasses and laughing. The dam remained, no longer an invisible relic but a recognized part of the system. Interpretive signs went up, telling the story of early settlement, of water stewardship, of how old solutions sometimes outlast new ones. One afternoon, I stood with the county engineer, the same one who'd first smiled at the stonework, watching water flow clean and steady. "You know," he said, "if this had been done right from the start, none of that would have happened." I nodded. "That's usually the case." Ridgecrest Heights, as an entity, didn't survive the year. The HOA dissolved under legal and financial strain. The development was sold off in pieces, some homes retrofitted properly, others left empty, reminders of what happens when confidence outruns understanding. I was offered money again, quietly this time. Settlements, speaking fees, consulting roles. I declined most of it. I accepted only what was necessary to maintain the land and the creek, to ensure the work would continue after I was gone. On the anniversary of my father's death, I took his notebook back up to the dam. The pages were softer now, edges worn from use. I sat on the stone and read his words out loud, letting them drift over the water. The creek answered, steady and alive. I thought that was the end of the story. The lesson learned. The balance restored. But there was one final moment, small and almost private, that closed the circle in a way no court ruling ever could. A young couple stopped by one evening as the sun dipped low, turning the water gold. They'd bought one of the retrofitted houses, they said. They wanted to thank me. They told me they'd chosen the place because of the creek, because of the history, because it felt honest. As they walked away, hand in hand, I realized something settle in my chest, warm and quiet. The fight hadn't just protected the past, it had shaped the future. And that, I knew, was the kind of justice that lasts. The last time I opened the dam, it wasn't because of rain or pressure or fear of what might happen if I didn't. It was a clear morning, the kind that smells like clean stone and cold water. The sky stretched wide and pale as if it had nothing left to hide. I stood there alone, boots planted on ground that had finally settled back into itself, listening to the creek speak in its old voice again, steady, confident, unafraid. People think justice arrives with noise, with shouting and headlines and verdicts read aloud. The truest kind arrives quietly after everyone else has gone home, when you're left alone with the thing you were protecting all along. In the months after Ridgecrest Heights collapsed, the valley changed in ways no press release could capture. The traffic thinned. The lights on the ridge dimmed. Houses that had once loomed like trophies softened into places where people actually lived. Some of the unfinished lots were bought by the county and turned into conservation land, buffers that let the creek breathe when it needed to. The rest were required to meet standards that actually meant something now, designed with margins instead of marketing. I watched the creek through all of it, through frost and thaw, through summer heat that baked the rocks warm enough to sit on barefoot, through autumn leaves that spun and dipped and caught along the edges before slipping downstream. It carried less anger now, less urgency. It sounded like memory instead of warning. The legal cases wound down slowly, like storms moving off over the horizon. Settlements were reached. Charges were filed where they could be proven. Some people walked away bruised but free, others didn't. A few names that had once been printed in bold on glossy brochures now appeared in much smaller type on court dockets. That was enough for me. I never celebrated their downfall. I didn't need to. The valley didn't either. Here, as something most people don't know, winning doesn't feel like standing on top of something broken. It feels like standing beside something restored and realizing it doesn't need you the way it once did. That you can step back now, that you can trust it to keep going. I started teaching in a way, not formally. Just walking the land with people who asked. County planners, engineering students, a few skeptical developers who'd heard my name and wanted to understand what they'd almost repeated. I showed them how water thinks, how it remembers paths long after you try to erase them. I showed them my father's notebook, now scanned and archived, but still warm with his handwriting when I held it. Some listened, some didn't, But the ones who did carried it forward, and that mattered more than convincing everyone. The house felt different too, lighter. The nights were quieter without trucks growling past at all hours. When I sat on the porch with my coffee in the mornings, I could hear the creek clearly again, its sound threading through birdsong and wind. I could tell how the day would go, just like my father said. Fast water meant trouble, slow water meant patience. There was one day late in the spring when a storm came through unexpectedly. Not the kind that announces itself days ahead of time, but a sudden hard rain that drums the earth and leaves just as quickly. I went up to the dam out of habit, not fear. The water rose, pressed, tested. The system responded the way it was designed to, controlled release. No panic. Downstream, the banks held. The valley absorbed it like a long breath. I stood there smiling, rain on my face, and realized I wasn't guarding anything anymore. I was just witnessing. A few weeks later, the county held a small ceremony. No speeches worth remembering, no ribbon to cut, just a plaque placed near the creek acknowledging the restoration and the history behind it. My family's name was there, small and simple among others who'd worked the land before me. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. After everyone left, I stayed behind, fingers tracing the engraved letters, listening to the water move past like it always had, like it always would if left alone to do what it knew. The young couple came back that evening, the same ones who'd thanked me before. This time they brought their child. A little girl with boots splashed clean of mud, eyes wide as she crouched near the bank, reaching toward the current. Her laughter rang out bright and fearless when the water touched her fingers. I felt something loosen inside my chest then, a knot I hadn't realized was still there. Later, as the sun slipped low and shadows stretched long, I walked the length of the creek one last time, from the dam down through the valley, past willows and stones and places my boots knew by heart. I listened. I remembered. I let go. The world beyond the ridge kept turning, full of people who would try to take shortcuts, who would see land and water as obstacles or opportunities instead of responsibilities. I couldn't stop all of that. No one can. But I could protect this. And by doing that, I'd learned something simple and permanent. When you stand your ground without violence, without shouting, with nothing but patience and proof and respect for what came before you, the truth has a way of reshaping everything around it. The creek kept flowing as I turned back toward home, its sound fading into the evening like a promise already kept.